Good evening. This evening we're pleased to once again welcome Dr. Stanley Monteith to the Granada Forum. He is a retired orthopedic surgeon, a researcher, a historian, an author, lecturer, and talk show host. Dr. Monteith has educated audiences both nationally and internationally on a wide variety of subjects and is particularly knowledgeable about teacher, author Carroll Quigley, having researched his life and times almost 30 years. Significantly, Professor Quigley was both instructor and mentor to a young, impressionable Bill Clinton, influencing him while he attended Georgetown University in the mid-1960s. Not surprisingly then, in accepting the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 1992, Clinton publicly acknowledged Quigley. Why are the professor's work and influence important? In his books, Tragedy and Hope and the Anglo-American Establishment, he speaks about a secret society comprised of the world's financial elite and their plan to create a worldwide feudalistic system under their control. Today, they allegedly dominate both major political parties in America, making a mockery of the democratic process. This evening, Dr. Monteith will speak to those subjects and share some shocking revelations and elaborate on why recognition of the hidden forces behind the Anglo-American secret society is essential if America hopes to survive as a free nation. Now please join me in a nice warm welcome for Dr. Stanley Monteith.
Well, good evening. Thank you. It's awfully good to be here with you again. And tonight I'm going to tell you an amazing, amazing story that is probably quite poorly understood. In fact, much of what we're going to tell you tonight we really haven't gone into before. It's been said that an understanding of the forces which have shaped the events of the 20th century is predicated not upon facts to be learned, but upon secrets to be discovered. Let me repeat that. An understanding of the forces which have shaped the events of the 20th century is predicated not on facts to be learned, but upon secrets to be discovered. And how do you really understand what indeed has happened during this 20th century as we see our nation going from crisis to crisis? We see wars and revolutions and disease throughout the world. We see a gradually lowering of American living standards. We see successive administrations, whether they be Republican or Democrat, who refuse to build any sort of a defense for America against nuclear attack. We knew that we've got the Republicans into office, everything was going to be fine. We'd get a balanced budget, we'd cut back on big government, and what have we done? Why, we've actually increased spending for next year and the year after that. In fact, many times the Republicans have been giving more money than the Democratic administration had asked for. And something's seriously wrong. Well, let me try to explain what it is. And as a preface, I'd like to tell you 3 poems, because these poems have to do with the shaping of our destiny. The first one was written in 1848 by Alfred Lord Tennyson, a British author, one of the greatest authors. He wrote the Charge of the Light Brigade. But he was also part of this belief in the British Empire, this idea that mankind could create a perfect world under Anglo-Saxon domination. The title of the poem is Locksley Hall. And this is what Lord Tennyson wrote. For I dipped into the future, far as any eye could see, saw a vision of the world and all the wonders that would be. Heard the heavens filled with shouting, and there rained a ghastly dew of the nation's airy navies grappling in the central blue, till the war drums throbbed no longer, and the battlefields were furled in the Parliament of Man, the federation of the world. Then the common sense of most will keep the awe in fretful awe, and the kindly earth shall slumber, lapped in universal law. It was a wonderful dream. This idea of a world government under the benevolent rule of world rule for world law. In October of 1993, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote an article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. And this is what he said: "The world of law will not be attained by exhortation. Law requires enforcement. Let's not kid ourselves that we can have a new world order without paying for it in blood as well as in money. Maybe the cost of enforcement will be too great. National interest, narrowly construed, maybe will be a safer rule. But let us recognize that we are surrendering a noble dream. Remember those lines of Tennyson that Churchill called the most wonderful of modern prophecies, and that Harry Truman carried in his wallet throughout his life. And then he quotes this poem that I've just given you. Now, why would Winston Churchill say that that was such a wonderful poem? I mean, wasn't Churchill dedicated to the British Empire? And Harry Truman, why, give him hell, Harry, why did he carry those words in his wallet all of his life? And then you look back to the time of Harry Truman's presidency when the United Nations Charter was written and confirmed. And then, of course, we offered the Marshall Plan to Europe because Europe was in danger of going communism, and then we offered the Marshall Plan to the communists. And that didn't quite make sense. And then, of course, China went communist, and Eastern Europe went communist, and then we went into the no-win war in Korea, all under Harry S. Truman, who carried the words to this poem in his wallet all of his life. The second poem I encountered when I went to live in Africa. And in the mid-1970s, I took my family, moved to South Africa, where I taught at a major university. And I was searching at that time, because I'd already heard of Carroll Quigley, I'd read his book, and I knew that South Africa had something to do with this move towards world government. And so it was that driving along the west coast of southern Africa, there I saw on a hillside this great monument. I didn't know what it was, but I was intrigued by it. I mean, what was this great granite monument doing there with the pillars almost looked like a small replica of the Lincoln Memorial? And so I climbed the long stairway past tier after tier of granite lions that were guarding the entrance to this almost shrine. And there within the portico, you see this great statue, the bust of a man and a pedestal beneath it. And inscribed on that pedestal were these words: "The intense and brooding spirit still shall quicken and control. Living, he was the land, and dead, his soul shall be her soul." Those words were penned by Rudyard Kipling to honor the man who adopted the vision that was put forward in Tennyson's poem. A man who was intent upon bringing world government under Anglo-Saxon domination. His name was Cecil John Rhodes. The intense and brooding spirit still shall quicken and control. To quicken is to come back to life. Living, he was the land, and dead, his soul shall be her soul. And let me tell you that there have been many men who wanted to rule the world. I mean, certainly Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. They say he died because he had no more worlds to conquer. Adolf Hitler, Rousseau. But no one has had more influence on the world than Cecil John Rhodes. And the tragedy is that most people don't understand that almost everything that's going on in the world today has to do with that man. The third poem was written by James Russell Lowell. It was also written in 1848. And it really summarizes the essence of the battle in which we're involved. James Russell Lowell was writing about the crisis of slavery as it faced America and the moral wrong that was going on, and the eternal battle that has always existed between good and evil. And this is what James Russell Lowell said: "Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide. And that strife of truth with falsehood for the good or evil side. Then it is the brave man chooses, while the coward stands aside, until the multitudes make virtue of the faith they have denied. Though the cause of evil prospers, yet his truth alone is strong. Though her portion be the scaffold, and upon the throne be wrong. But that scaffold sways the future, for in the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own." And he was talking about a strife of truth with falsehood. Well, I briefly wanted to mention one of my favorite murder mysteries. And you may wonder what this has to do with the story we're telling you tonight, but it's a story written by Agatha Christie. It's called Murder on the Orient Express, and it's the story of this train line that runs from Istanbul to Paris, and it brings the mystery of the East to the rationalism of the West. And during the early part of the century, this work of fiction tells of this train, and of course there are a number of Americans on it, and there is a Monsieur Poirot, who is a Belgian police officer. He's a Belgian detective. He's the hero of many Agatha Christie murder mysteries, murder stories. And there's a very disreputable American on this train who tells Monsieur Poirot that somebody's trying to kill him, and he wants Monsieur Poirot to protect his life, and he'll give him $5,000. He'll give him $10,000. He's worried about his life, and Monsieur Poirot says, no, I'm not interested. And that night, that very night, this man is murdered. And he's stabbed to death. And there's a question of who did it. And of course, Monsieur Poirot is recruited by the member of the board that controls the railway to find out who the murderer is. And they happen to be trapped in the snowdrift somewhere in the great mountains along the route of the Orient Express. And Monsieur Poirot says, there are too many clues. There are too many clues. But as we look at the world today, and we see this move towards the New World Order, we sometimes face exactly the same issue. There are just too many clues out there. In fact, we talk to people about what's really behind everything that's going on. And some people will tell you it's the bankers. It's the bankers because when we have wars, bankers make money. And if you read Professor Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, on page 324, he'll tell you how the central bankers are working in concert to create a feudalistic system by which they'll control the nations of the world by financial flow, and they're doing it secretly, and the banks are working all together. And people will tell you it's the bankers, and other people will say, oh, it's not the bankers, it's the Jewish bankers. It's the Jewish bankers, and they will tell you that the Federal Reserve has two types of stock, Class A and Class B, and all this money is going overseas, but you know, there's no evidence of any of that. And the tragedy is, if you look at the central bankers of the world, most of them are not Jewish. And that's what Professor Quigley says in his book. The vast majority of the central bankers are not Jewish at all. Well, there are other people who are going to say, oh, you don't understand. It's really the Council on Foreign Relations. Because since 1953, every chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, the head of the central bank in America, has come from the Council on Foreign Relations. Do you realize that every head of the Arms and Disarmament Agency in the United States since 1953 has come from the CFR. All but one Secretary of State, all but one Assistant Secretary of State, all but one Director of the CIA since 1953 has come from the Council on Foreign Relations. And furthermore, 7 of the last 9 presidents came from the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations is America's invisible government that's running the world. And people say, no. Council on Foreign Relations just is for America. It's the Bilderbergers, because the Bilderbergers combines the people of great wealth in America and the socialists in America, and they work with the Europeans, and they meet on a regular basis, and they pick our presidents, and Bill Clinton was picked by the Bilderberger group, and people said, no. It's the Trilateral Commission, because that includes the people from the Orient and from Japan and from the Pacific Rim, and this is an international movement towards world control. And others are going to say, you don't understand, it's really communism. Communism is the real enemy. Most people think that communism is dead. Communism isn't dead. The whole fall of communism was a sham. In fact, Gorbachev had actually created the Green Cross Foundation in the United States, taken the papers out for it 6 months before the phony revolution over there. Communism is in full military production for war. Don't you know that? You hear how the soldiers are starving, but they're building new nuclear weapons and new mobile intercontinental missiles, and America's unilaterally disarming, and that doesn't make any sense. And China's in full production for war, and there are 1.25 billion people who live under communism in China, and our government is doing everything they can to help them, and most favored nation treaty status, but not just that. Do you realize that 2/3 of all the new industries going in there are financed by American corporations and American international banks? Communism's the enemy. And others will say, oh, no, it's not communism at all, it's socialism, because every communist is a socialist, and there's a Socialist International out there, second, third most powerful organization in the world, and it has regular meetings, and the socialists throughout the world meet, and they work in conjunction with the communists to further their goals. And they say, oh, no, it isn't. That is the humanist, because every communist and Every socialist is a humanist. And if you haven't read the Humanist Manifesto, they've laid the whole plan out for world domination, and they're socialists, and they want world government, and they're pro-abortion and pro-homosexual and pro-criminal and pro-drug, and it's the humanists. And then there's people who say, oh no, it's the foundations. The great foundations of America, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, they're funding everything that's gone on in our society. They've been doing it for the last 100 years, and they're intent upon world government and socialism. And others will say, oh no, it's the Illuminati. It's the Illuminati. In fact, haven't you ever looked on the back of a dollar bill? You look on the back of that dollar bill, and what do you see there? You see the pyramid with the all-seeing eye over the top of that, and that's the symbol of the Illuminati. You see that? The number down underneath it says 1776, and that was the date that the Illuminati was founded. But the problem with that is that the Great Seal of the United States, from which this occult emblem came, and it isn't a cult emblem, and that's not the eye of the god that we worship. That's the sun god. If you read occultist, that's the eye of Horus. That is indeed the eye of Lucifer that's on the back of the dollar bill. But this design, at least the great eye, was actually suggested in 1790, just 4 years after the Illuminati was founded. It didn't have its tentacles into America at that time. This was actually put on the back of the Great Seal of the United States in 1782, just 6 years after the Illuminati was founded. And the 1776, from the very inception, when they were designing the Great Seal, had to do with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The Illuminati was a very powerful force in Europe. It infiltrated the Masonic lodges and played a part in the French Revolution. Others will say it's not the Illuminati, it's the Lucis Trust. If you've never heard of the Lucis Trust, it used to be called the Lucifer Trust. And this whole thing is Luciferian, and the Lucis Trust used to be right in the United Nations Plaza. And it's working today, and you'll find people like Robert Mueller and Theodore Hirschberg, formerly at Notre Dame, and many of our key and most important people in America are tied into the Lucis Trust, which used to be the Lucifer Trust, and it's all Luciferian. And others are going to say, no, you don't understand. It's the Masons. Do you realize that 14 American presidents have been Masons? Do you realize that people wonder why they took God out of our schools and God out of our public exhibits? Why we can't have four of the Supreme Court judges, of the 6 Supreme Court judges who voted to do that, were Masons, and the Masons have always supported separation of church and state in this wall of church and state because they worship a different God. And this indeed is a Masonic symbol. It isn't an Illuminati symbol. This is the Masons. And others are going to say, well, it isn't really the Masons, it's the New Age. The New Age has infiltrated every aspect of our life today. It's every place. If you haven't read the book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, you can get it, written by Marilyn Ferguson. And, if you look on the front of that, the symbol of theirs almost looks like 3 sixes intertwined. The New Age movement is certainly one of the most powerful movements in the world today. And then there's others who say, oh no, it's the oligarchy, it's the ruling houses of Europe. These are the royal blood that's been there for years, working behind the scenes, because one of them eventually will become the king of Jerusalem, who will be the Antichrist. And then there's the story of the Priory of Sion, which was supposedly a secret society that's been written about in a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and they claim that this secret society goes back to the bloodline of the union of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene, and of course this is totally blasphemous, but there are really people who believe that the Priory, the Sion, and their Moravian kings and Moravian lines go into the Habsburgs and into Prince Carlos of Spain, King Carlos of Spain. And then, of course, there are others who really believe that we're dealing with the Rosicrucians. The Rosicrucians come out of the mystery religions. It's a powerful secret society. It has branches right over in San Jose, in California, in the East, all throughout America. There are others who tell you it's the Skull and Bones Society. After all, George Bush came from there. William Buckley came from there. Ties into the Central Intelligence Agency, secret society out of Yale. Other people, of course, will tell you it's Theosophy. Madame Blavatsky's secret society. Has their headquarters up here at Ojai, back at Wheaton, Illinois. It has tentacles into every aspect of our society. There are others who tell you it's really the UFOs and those foreign little critters who are here beaming ideas down into our minds. And I'm reminded then of what Monsieur Perot as he analyzed what was happening on the Orient Express. And of course, now they're trapped in a snowdrift, and he's talked to all of the various suspects, and every single one of them had a motive for killing this American. And of course, he is totally puzzled. There are too many clues. Everybody there has a motive. Well, as we look at what's going on in the world today, we are told, well, if we could just control abortion, if you are a moral individual and you will spend your efforts to do something about the murder of the unborn throughout, not only in America, but throughout the world, this is the real problem, abortion. Or the real problem is homosexuality, and which manifests the breakdown in our society, or it's crime, or it's drugs, or it's education, or environment, or evolution, or all of these things are real, and they're real problems. Population control, immigration. But you see, these are all issues that are being put forth so that we will be on the defensive. And as long as we are on the defensive, we are going to continue losing this battle. And so let me take you into something I know something about. And perhaps we can, by analyzing Professor Carroll Quigley and his writings, we can begin to understand what this whole incredible move towards world government is really all about. I got started this battle back in 1962. Cuba had just gone communist. Fidel Castro had been in America after the revolution. He had been lauded. He'd spoken to Congress. He had hugged Richard Nixon. He was going back from America to Cuba to fight communism. And then suddenly he was a communist. And something was wrong about that. I wasn't very smart at the time. I was just out of my orthopedic training. I was a busy young orthopedist in a community. Now has about 10 orthopedists. I think there were 2 of us there at the time. And we were just working day and night. But I began to be fascinated by what was happening. I began reading. And first of all, I learned about communism and the fact that the communists controlled almost 1/3 of the people and 1/3 of the landmass of the world. And this was rather scary because you see country after country after country going communist. And Eastern Europe had gone communist after the Second World War, and China had gone communist. And how did it all happen? And then we began to read the book, and we have it back here on the table, Foundations, Their Power and Influence. We found that the great foundations had been working to influence the American people to bring communism to China and to bring socialism and communist ideas into America. And then we learned about the Council on Foreign Relations. And then in 1966, a little-known professor back at Georgetown University named Carroll Quigley wrote a book. It was called Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. And it was a fascinating story because it talked about a secret society which had been organized and had led to the development of the Council on Foreign Relations. Even more intriguing was the story of what happened to that book, because it was initially published and distributed by Macmillan, and no sooner was out than suddenly Macmillan was purchased by somebody else, and somebody destroyed the plates to the first half of the book. And, of course, there was a tremendous demand for the book. All the Birchers were reading it, and all the conservatives were reading it. And all over the world, people wanted the book, and, of course, it was unavailable because somebody had destroyed the plates to the first half of the book. Now, Professor Quigley was a liberal, and he saw nothing wrong with the secret society or any of the things he had uncovered. He just thought that people ought to know about it, and not only that, but he wanted the money that came from the royalties. And so he went to the publisher, and they lied to him. And for years, they lied to him about what had happened to the plates of the book. And when finally his wife got so mad that she went down and demanded to know what was happening, and they admitted the plates of the first half of the book had been destroyed, but they refused to ever publish the book in its entirety. They did republish the last half of the book, but it really didn't tell you much of anything. It had really no meaning. It's sort of like coming into a movie when it's 2/3 over and never knowing how it started. So, incidentally, if what I've told you sounds a little far out, we have a taped interview with Professor Quigley back there. I think we're just about out of them, but we have lots of them back home. It's in our secret government tapes, or you can get them separately. They're called the Carroll Quigley tapes. And Carroll Quigley will tell you just what I've told you. Well, Carroll Quigley's story, in essence, was this: that back in 1870, there was a young man, and his name was Cecil John Rhodes, and he sat in a class at Oxford University, and he heard a talk given by a professor named John Ruskin. And John Ruskin was a dynamic speaker. And he talked about the British Empire and the obligation of the British aristocracy and art, because he was basically an art critic teacher. And he put them all together and talked about them all about morality. And he spoke in such wonderful and glowing terms that he touched the hearts and minds of literally dozens of his students. And many of them dedicated their entire lives to his dream. Now, John Ruskin used to read Plato every day. He believed in what Plato had written about the establishment of a world government under the rule of a ruling elite. That's what Plato really talked about in his Republic. He talked about the failings of democracy, but you wanted a ruling elite. And so Cecil Rhodes copied down in longhand what he heard that day in the lecture by John Ruskin, and he kept those words with him all of his life, and that became his purpose in life. He went off to Africa. He was able to buy the diamond and gold mines of Africa, and at a relatively young age, why, he was one of the wealthiest men in the world. Now, Cecil Rhodes then wrote a Confession of Faith in 1877. I've heard many stories about the Confession of Faith, but to my knowledge, I've only seen one other person who's ever actually had it. But we have it here reduplicated. Actually, as Cecil Rhodes typed it out, he wasn't a very good typist, but you'll see his handwriting here in a few places. And this is the Confession of Faith, and what he basically said is the fact that why shouldn't we form a secret society to take over control of the world? The idea gleaming and dancing before one's eyes like a will-o'-the-wisp at last frames itself into a plan. Why should we not form a secret society with one object, the furtherance of the British Empire, for the bringing of the whole uncivilized world under British rule, and the recovery of the United States, for the making of the Anglo-Saxon race, but one empire? And of course then, he attached this to the first of his 7 wills. And actually he attached that to the first 5 of his 7 wills. And then he set out to recruit men to join this secret society. Well, of course, Rhodes was a ruthless individual. He was ruthless in dealing with people who thought he was his friends. He was ruthless with the natives of Africa. He would befriend some tribal chief and tell him, what a great friend he was, and then he'd send the British troops in to slaughter the people. He went into the Transvaal Republic, the Orange Free State, and befriended the Afrikaners, and then tried to create a revolution there in 1895. And finally, they got the Boer War going in 1899, and the Boer War was certainly one of the bloodiest wars. I mean, you're talking about a very, very small nation. The Afrikaners, there weren't that very many of them. But at the end of the war, there were 100,000 British casualties, and only 7,000 Boers were killed. One of the greatest tragedies of all time for the British. Well, we know a little bit from reading Tragedy and Hope, and that is that the secret society actually was formed. And in the inner core of that secret society, according to Professor Quigley, there were 3 men: William Stead, Lord Milner, and Lord Brett. Now, William Stead was the publicist, and he handled the propaganda in London, whipping up support for the war. Milner was the High Commissioner in South Africa, who promoted the war. And of course, Brett, who later came to be known as Lord Esher. Lord Esher was the advisor to the King of England. And of course then, so they used the king, they manipulated the king, they manipulated the press, and they had their war going. And of course, at the end of the war, why Milner took over control of everything. Cecil Rhodes had died in 1902. And then, of course, Milner got together a group of young men who'd come to help him to rebuild. Now, they destroyed South Africa. They burned all the farms. They killed all the animals. They destroyed everything. And now they had to rebuild it after destroying it. And so a group of young aristocrats came from England, and they joined with Milner. They came to be known as Milner's Kindergarten. And then in 1909, they returned to England after rebuilding this nation that they destroyed to form something that was known as the Round Table. And the Round Table then operated as a front group for the secret society. And of course, it was operational then during the First World War. And although Professor Quigley doesn't really tell you, they were instrumental in creating the First World War. They were the dominant force in bringing England into that war. And the man who was primarily responsible was Sir Edward Grey, the British foreign minister, who, although Quigley denies it, was obviously part of their movement. We can tell you later how we know that. Well then, of course, after the war, they've killed all the graduates of Harrow and Eton and Harvard, and Oxford and Cambridge. They've lost a whole generation of the youth of England. And so they approach Americans at the Paris Peace Conference, and they say, you've got to take over leadership. I mean, we want to have world government under Anglo-Saxon domination. The only country that can do it is America. And then Professor Quigley tells us how the Council on Foreign Relations was formed out of these meetings. It's all there in the book. And of course he tells how they took over the control of our banks and our foundations and our corporations, how they took over the control of our government. It's all in tragedy and hope, the history of the world in our time. No wonder somebody destroyed the plates to the first half of the book. Well, it's a fascinating summary. If you read pages 324 of the book, he tells you how the central banks are going to work to create a feudalistic system throughout the world. On page 325, he tells you the most carefully kept secret of banking, and that is that banks create money out of nothing. On page 866, he will tell you what the plan is. You're going to have elections, but it's not going to make any difference who you vote for, because they're going to control who gets elected. And they're going to number every one of you at birth. They're going to follow you through life, through your education, your service, maybe voluntary, maybe military, through your health insurance, your disability benefits, your old age benefits, and even the death benefits. And you're going to be totally controlled. Isn't that wonderful? And he thought that was really wonderful because he looked upon us common people as the petty bourgeois. That was his term. The people who supported Berry, Coldwater. He had total contempt for you and I, but he was brilliant. And we owe him a debt of gratitude. He was a genius. I mean, I poured through his papers weeks on end trying to understand this man and really what it was all about, what motivated him, what energized him. On pages 950, and of course his most famous statement, and I'm sure most of you have heard it, he just simply talks about how these foolish right-wingers believe that they're communists in the American government. And they thought that the communists were responsible for Eastern Europe going communist, and the communists were responsible for China going communist. And these right-wingers, these foolish petty bourgeois, don't understand. This myth, like all fables, does in fact have a modicum of truth. There does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the Communist Act. In fact, this network, which we shall call the Round Table Group, has no aversion to cooperating with communists, and often it does so. For I've studied this for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine his papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims, and have for much of my life been close to it and to many of its instruments. I've objected both in the past and recently to a few of its policies, but in general my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known. On pages 1200 and 1201, he tells you that wars are not fought to win anymore. In fact, Bill Clinton, of course, was a student there in 1966 during the Vietnam War. And Professor Quigley told him the truth. We don't go into wars to win them. We don't go into wars to defeat the enemy. We just go into wars to further our own interests, and we leave the other government intact so we'll have somebody to negotiate with. Is it little wonder that Bill Clinton, understanding what this war in Southeast Asia was totally a phony war, should you be surprised that Bill Clinton didn't want to risk his life fighting in the jungles of Vietnam when he understood the power elite didn't want to win that war? An awful lot of brave men died, but what did they die for? For the limited aims of our power elite. Well, on pages 1247 and 1248, he lays it all out. He says, you know, we have a two-party system. But most people talk about a right and a left, a conservative and a liberal. There's a difference. No, you don't understand. What we need are both political parties just the same. So you can vote one party out as often as you want to. Vote out the rascals, but it doesn't make any difference because the same foreign and domestic policy continues. He had it all laid out in the book. Little wonder the plates of the first half of that book were destroyed. But this is not the first time. I can give you example after example of active suppression of books here within the United States. Well, 1972 came, and a book came out called None Dare Call It Conspiracy, and I'm sure most of you have read that. It was written by Larry Abraham and Gary Allen, and this took Professor Quigley's work and then it sort of put a little twist on it, and part of that was, well, who's really responsible for this are the bankers, and they all have Jewish names: Rothschild, Goldman Sachs, you go down the line. But they never mention any of the other central bankers. The predominant number have nothing to do with being Jewish, but it sort of laid that background for anybody who talked about the conspiracy to say, well, they were anti-Semitic because, and then they talk about the two classes of stock, the A stock and the B stock, and the A stock's all owned by the Europeans, and they're getting all the money from all the interest that we're paying for bonds. And it's a great story, but if you study it, it just isn't true. And then, of course, I think the real crux of the book was that communism is controlled from New York City. And, of course, Nelson Rockefeller had gone to Russia, and they got rid of Khrushchev. The very weekend that he was over there, they got rid of Khrushchev. And you know what that means. And there were a lot of Americans who said, yeah, but it seems logical. I mean, we've financed communism since its very inception, and we have. There's no question. I mean, if you want to go in the background of financing communism, you haven't read Anthony Sutton's 3-parts trilogy on Soviet Western technology and Soviet economic development put out by Hoover Institute. Why, I mean, it's all there. We financed communism from its inception. You get hold of Herbert Hoover's memoirs, and of course he was in charge of relief during the immediately after the First World War. 95% of the relief efforts sent to Russia massive amounts of food and medical supplies, and where did they go? To the communists. 5% went to the anti-communists. Now, that's hardly what you would expect if Russia was really a danger to America, and if the Russians were really trying to destroy capitalism. Is it? It doesn't really make sense. If you read the biography of General Wrangel, he was the commander of the Army of the South, fighting the communists who were advancing, and he was a white Russian, and the majority of the army didn't want communism. The majority of people in Russia did not want communism. But General Wrangel made one serious mistake, and that is that he allowed himself to become dependent upon the British, and once they controlled the supply lines, they said, you will stop all further resistance, you will retreat to the Black Sea, you will be evacuated, and that's the end. And General Wrangel never understood what was going on, but what he didn't understand was that the English government at that time was totally controlled by Lord Milner and his people. Because in 1916, when Lloyd George was elected the Prime Minister of England, replacing the initial Asquith, who was the initial Prime Minister, got England into the war, and the English people wanted to get out of the war. What they didn't understand is that Lloyd George had a secretariat, and 4 of the 6 members of that secretariat just happened to come from the 20 or 30 people that were in the round table. And there was a war cabinet. Who was on the war cabinet? Why, Lord Milner and 2 other men. But the entire staff of the war cabinet, 2 of them were selected by Milner, and 2 were selected by Lord Esher, or who was Brett, who was one of the 3 original members of the secret society. And of course, there was Brett, there was Lord Esher advising the King of England. It was all controlled, it was all contrived, and they fought 4 bloody years for a war that was fought simply to destroy the infrastructure of Europe, so that they could bring in the League of Nations and a new world government. And if you want to challenge that, we can give you some of the documentation on it. Well, anyway, this is an amazing, amazing story that Professor Quigley laid out in Tragedy and Hope. But the question was, how did he know it? I mean, if you read Tragedy and Hope, there's not one footnote. Not one. So, 1980, I decided I was going to find out what the basis of this was, and I went back to Georgetown, and I spent several weeks going through his files, and that's where I found the tape that we have, a taped interview with Professor Quigley, where he tells you the story about how his publisher destroyed the plates in the first half of his book, and then he talks about the symbol on the back of the dollar bill, the occult symbol, and he says, you know, these crazy right-wingers, they're coming to me and they're telling me that that's the symbol of the Illuminati. I said, that isn't the symbol of the Illuminati. That symbol goes back 5,000 or 6,000 years. That symbol has been used in pagan and ancient and mystery religions for 5,000 years. And most people don't know that. Most people don't know where that symbol comes from and why it's significant that on the back of the American dollar bill, this symbol exists. Well, anyway, I went to Quigley's papers. And, of course, how he found out about the secret society. I mean, how do you find out about a secret society when everybody's sworn to secrecy? Well, one man, in fact, there were 3 men who told us the story, or told him the story. 2 men told him the story. One, a man we've tracked down on our own. And the first was Professor Zimmern. And about 1946-47, Quigley was over in Europe studying the power structure of Great Britain, and he came across a man named Alfred Zimmern. He was a professor, and Alfred Zimmern told him that he had belonged to a secret society between 1910 and 1922. Now, if you read the book that was published the following year, The Anglo-American Establishment, we have it back there, Professor Quigley will tell you that the only way he could write about the secret society is because he knew somebody on the inside, but he never tells you who it was. The reason I know who it was is because I've got all of his papers. I copied them. Cost a fortune, but we've got volumes and volumes of these papers. All of his letters to Zimmern, where they're trying to calculate who was in the secret society when it was first formed. And the letters from Zimmern to Quigley and Quigley to Zimmern. So Zimmern is the one who told him about it in the book, The Anglo-American Establishment. Quigley says that Zimmern was in the secret society between 1910 and 1922. And the reason that Zimmern got out was, I mean, he was an idealist. He went into the secret society. He believed in the First World War. It was to change the world. It was to defeat the Germans. And, of course, the French were their allies. The Germans were the enemy. And he could go along with all the carnage and the horror of the war, although I'm sure it must have bothered him somewhat. It would bother any moral individual when you realize that there were about 21 million people killed, about 7.5 million soldiers, and about 12.5 million civilians, and probably twice that many injured and carrying the pain of their wounds to their death, maybe 50 or 60 million dead and wounded during the war. And I'm sure that must have bothered Zimmern, but Germany was the enemy and France was the ally. And then immediately after the First World War, suddenly the secret society shifted gears, and now Germany was the ally and France was the enemy, and that was too much for Professor Zimmern, so he dropped out. Now, he was afraid to talk about it, but he told Professor Quigley. And Professor Quigley then spent 20 years researching this. Now, there was one other man. His name was William T. Stead. You remember there were three people in the secret society, Stead and Milner and Brett. How do we know that? Well, fortunately, Stead was thrown out of the secret society because he didn't really believe in the Boer War. And so he wrote about it in his diary. And we have the pages from his diary back there, or some of them are reduplicated in This Is America, Destined for Dictatorship, because I've simply taken many of these books and taken the important pages out. And Stead actually talks about how they sat around at his home at Mulberry House in 1891 and plotted how they were going to create the secret society. And then, of course, he has the letters from Rhodes to him in about 1900, talking about the secret society, and he republished those in a book called The Last Will and Testament of Cecil John Rhodes. So there's no question at all that the secret society was formed, and here we have Stead attesting to it. We have Professor Zimmern attesting to it, and one other man. His name was H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells had actually spent a great deal of time with the members of the secret society. And if you read Wells' great book, it's entitled An Experiment in Autobiography. And Wells tells you that between 1902 and 1908, there were a number of men who met together at a dinner club. And there was Lord Milner, there was Leopold Amory, and the name may not mean much to you, but Amory would have been part of Milner's kindergarten, part of a round table, and he was the man who, in 1939, stood up as a member of Parliament, pointed at Chamberlain and said, "You've been here too long, go." That was what they'd said to Cromwell several hundred years before. And, of course, Chamberlain resigned, and, of course, that brought in Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was part and parcel of this movement. How do we know? Well, first of all, because we have a letter that he wrote to H.G. Wells. We got it out of the Wells Library back at University of Chicago, I think it is, where Churchill says to Wells, "I really can't talk about this outside of this secret circle." Well, Wells, who was in the secret society? Well, there was, in the coefficients that met every week or so for, 6 years, 1902 to 1908. There was Milner, Lord Grey, who was the foreign minister who took England into the war, Lord Brand, who was the CEO of Lazard Brothers, so-called international Jewish banking house. Actually, it was controlled by a member of the Round Table, just as in the United States, Lehman Brothers. Boy, doesn't that sound Jewish? Who was headed by Pete Peterson, a Greek who became chairman of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations for many years. And so they keep those Jewish names out there, and they do it intentionally, so that your attention will be diverted from what this is really all about. But so many of these organizations are actually headed by people who tie into this secret society who are not Jewish at all. So let's, then we had Lord Cecil, and so there were actually 5 people on one side, and they were all part of the British aristocracy. They were the ruling elite, and 3 of them, Brand, Milner, and Leopold Amory, were all part of the Round Table group. On the other side, you had H.G. Wells, you had George Bernard Shaw, you had Bertrand Russell, you had Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and you had the founders of the Fabian Socialists. And they plotted for a number of years how they would bring about a one-world socialist government. In fact, coming out of those meetings, Wells wrote 2 books. One, The Open Conspiracy, and said, we're going to be in charge of Moscow probably long before we control New York. We're going to create a one-world government just exactly as they have in Russia with socialism. The bankers are going to help us. This is The Open Conspiracy by H.G. Wells. The other was a book called The New World Order, in which he talked about how the one-world government was coming. And both of these books, according to Wells, in his book, An Experiment in Autobiography, actually came out of those meetings between the ruling aristocracy of England, who were tied into this secret society, and the Fabian Socialists. So you saw the socialists from below and the other people from above, and of course Brand tied into banking, Milner was tied into banking, people, and Cecil, Lord Cecil was there, was tied into banking. The most powerful men in England were plotting with the Fabian Socialists on how they would bring socialism. Why did they want socialism? Isn't socialism going to take from the rich and give to the poor? No, it's going to bring everybody under the control of the rich. That's what it's really all about, because they always will control the government buying and selling politicians. They did it in England, and they've done it in America. Socialism is said to be a sincere, benevolent, idealistic theory, but it doesn't work without force, and somebody's going to be in control of that socialist society. And even Karl Marx, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, talked about the dictatorship not by the proletariat, but of the proletariat. It was a dictatorship by which the common people would be controlled. And that's really what they were planning on. But H.G. Wells wrote another book. It was called The New Machiavellis. And it was a story, now in novel form, admittedly, but it was a story of a secret society that was headed by a German. It was an English secret society that controlled the English government, that was headed by a German. And of course, Lord Milner was a German. I mean, he was a British citizen, but he was of German extraction. And of course, only fictional, except that Leo Amory, in his diary, refers to that book, and he says, and we have Leo Amory's diary, and he says, hey, H.G. Wells was talking about our group. That was us. So here we have 3 people who attest to the formation of a secret society in England. Then we have an American. His name was Frederick Howe. And Frederick Howe was at the Paris peace negotiations after the carnage of Europe had come to an end. And he was a real idealist. I mean, he was one of these head-in-the-clouds liberals who could justify the First World War because England had to honor a 50-year-old treaty with Belgium where England promised that they would defend Belgium if attacked. And so treaties were sacred, and if treaties weren't honored, how would we ever have world peace and world law? How would we ever have the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the world? And so Frederick Howe was there in England with Colonel House, and Howe was one of the chief men in this whole movement. It was called the Inquiry. And there you saw Thomas Lamont, who was a partner in J.P. Morgan, and you have John Foster Dulles, and Allen Dulles was there. Christian Herter, you remember Christian Herter became Secretary of State. John Foster Dulles became Secretary of State. Allen Dulles head of the CIA. But all these men, this was 1919. But Howe was there too. And he was asked to go over all of the treaties dealing with Palestine, the Palestine area. And because he was actually President Wilson, and the House wanted him to enter and help with the American input on the negotiations. What did he find? Well, he found, first of all, that the English, who gone into the war because they believed in treaties, world rules, the world law, and treaties were sacred, almost like the Bible. The English had, first of all, promised the Arabs that if they came in on the English side, that they'd give them Palestine. Then they made a secret treaty with the French, and they promised that they'd give the French Palestine. And then they promised to give, through the Balfour Declaration, the Jews Palestine. And they'd given Palestine to 3 different groups. And suddenly Frederick Howe realized they don't believe in treaties at all. It's all been for nothing. All these people have died. This carnage, this horror. I mean, you talk about warfare. I mean, what happened on the Western Front and the bayonet charges, the trench warfare. 4 bloody, horrible years. If you've ever read into the stories of the people who were there, horrible, horrible, horrible carnage. It's all been for nothing. And so Frederick Howe said, what was it really all about? And so Frederick Howe thought, well, it has to do with economic imperialism. Maybe it had to do with commercial interests, so that the British would be able, commercial interests would have a better trading advantage over the Germans. Maybe that was what it was about. And then he said that a group of men came to him. They were known as Lord Milner's men, and he named them. They were the men who surrounded the Prime Minister at that time. This is 1919. The Prime Minister of England is Lloyd George. And they said to Frederick Howe, you know, we've got to get you to join with us to create this world government. This is what it's all about. And he said, you know, they didn't even know the meaning of the term economic imperialism. And they told him the war had nothing to do with economic imperialism. It had to do with the white man's burden to rule the world. The white man has to rule the world. That's our obligation. That's our destiny. And that's why the war had to be fought to its conclusion. Because without that, they wouldn't have destroyed the existing social structure of Europe. It's all there, Confessions of a Reformer. But of course, you're never going to hear most of these things from Ted Koppel or Dan Rather or Barbara Walters. Well, they have one other person who will attest to what this is really all about, Admiral Chester Ward. Admiral Ward is quoted in Barry Goldwater's excellent book. Actually, we have the quotation in here, or you can get it from Kissinger on the Couch, which Chester Ward wrote with Phyllis Schlafly. And Admiral Ward, 16 years in the Council on Foreign Relations, finally came out and said, look, he said, this is what it's all about. There is a small clique within this organization that is totally dedicated to the destruction of national sovereignty, and they're totally dedicated to world government. And of course, he felt this was terrible. He was a man, a member of the military, a Judge Advocate General of the Navy, who really believed in America's independent state. He realized the Council on Foreign Relations was being used to program people to support this internationalist dream for the Parliament of Man, the federation of the world. So how then does this all tie together? Well, Monsieur Perot, as he was looking at all of the suspects, realized that in the dead man's body there were 12 stab wounds, and there were 12 suspects, every one of whom had a motive to kill the American. And he said, there are too many clues. 12 stab wounds, 12 people, all with a motive. Well, as we look at what's going on in the world today, how do we begin to put this together? And so let's just take what Professor Quigley has told us about the origins of the Council on Foreign Relations, and let's go back to Cecil John Rhodes. Who was he really? What motivated Cecil John Rhodes? And what most people do not understand is Cecil Rhodes had entered the Masonic Lodge. He had sworn the oaths of fidelity to the light. Now, how many of you here, well, I won't ask that because probably most of you know what the light is in Masonry, but if you go into the Blue Lodge of Masonry, the first thing you do is they blindfold you, they put a noose around your neck, they bare your chest here, and then they roll up your pant leg, and then they march you up before the worshipful master and they say, what do you most want? And you're told you're supposed to say the light. So you say the light. And then you go into the second level of the lodge and they say, what do you most want? And you're supposed to say more light. And then the third level of the lodge, why you want even more light. But you never know what the light is. Nobody ever tells you. In fact, you're told as you go up to the levels of the lodge that they're going to tell you the secret. The trouble is that they never tell you the secret. You may catch a glimpse of this as you read the esoteric writings of Masonry, but most people within the Masonic Lodge are intentionally deceived. And if you read Morals and Dogma, written by Albert Pike, he will tell you, we intentionally deceive people coming into the lodge. Why? Because we don't want them to know. Most of them are not worthy to know the real secret. If you read Manly Hall, now Albert Pike died in 1891. During the 20th century, the leading Masonic philosopher is a man named Manly P. Hall. In fact, he had his headquarters right down here in the Los Angeles area. I don't know how many of you know of it, but Manly P. Hall had written extensively on Masonry before he ever joined the lodge. Became a 33rd degree Mason, one of the leading Masonic philosophers. And he said, Masonry is a fraternity within a fraternity. Most Masons are wonderful people. They have a good time. They do good things. But there is an inner fraternity dedicated to the mystery, to the secrets. And of course, Manly Hall wrote extensively on what those secrets were. And of course, unless you understand those secrets, you can't understand what energized Cecil John Rhodes, or why the symbol is on the back of the American dollar bill. What does that symbol really stand for? And what does it really mean? And why is nobody concerned that that symbol is on the back of the dollar bill? Well, first of all, you can read what the occultists will tell you. They will tell you that the pyramid has to do with pagan rites. And in pagan rites for the last 5,000 to 6,000 years, the pyramid has been the symbol. It's got 13 steps on it. It has nothing to do with 13 colonies. 13 is a secret occult number that gives tremendous power. The term above, which I can't pronounce, but it has to do with he favors our venture. The Novus Order Seclorum has to do with a new social order, the new order of the ages. 1776, they will tell you, has to do with the date when America was created. And the all-seeing eye above is the eye of the God, of the sun, the eye of light. Well, Cecil Rhodes, after entering the Masonic Lodge and hearing the lecture by John Ruskin, suddenly became consumed with this idea that it was his destiny to create a one-world government. Now, we knew he'd never lived to see it come to pass, but he believed that he would form the foundation for this one-world government. And he began then to recruit men to his cause. You remember there were three men initially. There was William Stead, there was Lord Esher, his name was Brett, and there was Lord Milner. Stead was an occultist. He was a member of the Theosophical Organization. He was deeply involved in spiritualism. Why was he interested in getting into an organization with Cecil Rhodes? Because occultists, and you read occult writings, they will all tell you we're moving towards a new age. We're moving towards a new one-world government. We're moving towards a new spirituality. If you read the material which we have, read Carol Quigley's book, read the pages from White's book, actually taken from Stead's diary, you'll find out that the second level of the secret society was a man named Lord Balfour, Arthur Balfour. And Arthur Balfour had formed the Society for Psychical Research. And Professor Quigley tells us in his book, The Anglo-American Establishment, that the men who joined with Milner after Cecil Rhodes' death primarily came from the Society for Psychical Research. They were all into the occult. And this is the common denominator behind everything that's going on. If you go into the Council on Foreign Relations today, you'll be amazed to find how many of these men are into the Lucis Trust, are into Theosophy, are into Masonry, and the underlying focus of everything that's going on today is occultism working within every one of these organizations. Now, most people think communism is an atheistic form of philosophy. In other words, Karl Marx was an atheist. He talked about religion being the opiate of the masses. And then most people are usually incredibly naive. Karl Marx was a Satanist. And if you haven't read the book, Marx and Satan by Reverend Warren Brown, who spent 14 years in a communist prison, you have to, and we carry that through our ministry. And Marx and Proudhon and Bakunin, who were the three leading socialists at that time, were all into Satanism, and they embraced socialism as a means of destroying Christian civilization, Western civilization. That's what it was really all about. Mikhail Gorbachev today is a New Ager. You go to his State of the Union, State of the World forums in San Francisco or down in Mexico, and the whole theme is occultism. And what does Mikhail Gorbachev talk about? What we need is a one world order, a new world order, and a new world spirituality. At the recent conference that was held in In Rio de Janeiro, it was called the Earth Summit Plus 5, or whatever the original meeting was there in 1992. They had a new one earlier this year in 1997. And they're stressing new spirituality. What are they talking about? They're talking about doing away with the Judeo-Christian ethic and replacing it with a new world religion. If you get into the background of Masonry and you begin studying what the Masonic philosophers will tell you about the light, if you read Albert Pike, and he actually goes into some detail talking about, and here I think on page 321, he says, Lucifer, the light bearer. Strange the mysterious name to give to the spirit of darkness. Lucifer, the son of the morning. He says, he who bears the light, doubt it not. Lucifer is the god of Masonry. And if you doubt that, we can give you all sorts of references, but probably Manly Hall is the best source of that. And his quotation is really very, very clear. And he basically talks about the strength of a man was not given to be used destructively, but that he might build a temple worthy to be the dwelling place of the great architect of the universe. When the Mason learns that the key is the proper application of the dynamo of living power, he shall have understood the mystery of the craft and the seething energies of Lucifer in his hands. And that comes from his book, The Lost Keys of Freemasonry. It's all Luciferian. That's the driving force behind Masonry and Theosophy and the Lucis Trust, behind communism, behind the Council on Foreign Relations. Behind all of this is Luciferianism. Of course, here we're out there, we're trying to, elect people to public office, and we're going to save things, we're going to save America because we're going to elect Bob Dole to the president. He's a 33rd degree Mason. And so is Jack Kemp, who ran with him, and they were running against Bill Clinton, who comes from the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderbergers. Did you ever give a sucker an even chance? This symbol is the symbol of the mystery religions. The mystery religions, which have always been there since antiquity, since the Garden of Eden. The battle really started in the Garden of Eden. You saw it played out when Cain killed Abel. Why? Because Cain resented the fact that there was supposed to be a blood sacrifice, and God didn't want his sacrifice of grain. He hated Abel because Abel was favored by God. It was the same battle that you saw when God destroyed the whole earth, other than Noah at the time of the Great Flood. And you saw it played out when you had the destruction of the Temple of Babylon, when Nimrod wanted to unite all civilization under his leadership. You saw it at the Mount of Temptation when the devil offered Christ the whole world, all the kingdoms of the earth. He would only kneel down and worship him. And that same battle is being played out today in our halls of Congress, in our Supreme Court. It's being played out in our schools. There's a battle between good and evil. But it's not imaginary, it's not theoretical. How do you explain abortion today with worldwide probably the murder of 500 million unborn children? How do you explain the AIDS epidemic, which today is decimating Africa? We have the statistics out of Africa. They're being collected by the U.S. Census Bureau. Doesn't that make you feel good? We're monitoring the HIV epidemic in Africa. Now, we're not monitoring it in America. We have no statistics in America that are comparable to what we have out of Africa. But in Africa, if you look at the nations in Central and Southern Africa, the capital cities, and any of you want this, we'll be glad to send it to you or tell you how you can call the U.S. Census Bureau and get it. The incidence, low incidence, that's you and me that have no identifiable risk factors, about 15 to 36% are infected and they're all going to die. High risk, that's Army, the people in the government who use prostitutes, people with STDs, from about 40 to 86%. In Harare, 32% of the low-risk people, the capital city of Zimbabwe, 86% of the military and high-risk people are all infected and they're all going to die. The greatest human tragedy of all time, and what are you reading in your newspapers? Well, less people are dying in America from the disease. Now, they don't tell you the same number of people are coming down with AIDS every year, 50,000 a year, but less people are dying because we have medicines. But that's not doing any good in Africa and Asia, where they're allowing this epidemic to be used for genocide. If you read the Bible, you read Revelation 6, 8, they tell that a quarter of the world is going to be destroyed by famine and plague. And if you read the NIV, I believe, and one of the other, it talks about by the plagues. This is biblical plague of truly biblical proportions. We're involved in the most amazing battle of all time, and everybody's fighting the wrong enemy. And it's about time that people started talking about what Masonry really represents, because we've got the writings of the Masons who tell you it's Luciferian. And I don't care what the people say, well, it's good. Look all the good we do. Look at all the good Adolf Hitler did. He put in great new roads all across Europe, the Autobahns. And they improved the health care. And they improved the education for the people of Germany. Of course, the people in the occupied areas, they didn't give much education to, as Adolf Hitler said, just teach them how to be able to read the road signs so they can stay out of the way of my tanks, but don't educate them. And that's why we're not educating the kids in America today, because we're intentionally dumbing them down. That's why we've taken God out of our schools, and 4 of the 6 Supreme Court judges who voted to take God out of our schools were Masons. The Masons have always wanted to destroy Christianity in America and to destroy the fabric of this society, and that's simply the inner core of this Masonic organization. Now, much of what I told you about the background of the Council on Foreign Relations is contained in this, and we're working on a new treatise. We'll have it in a couple of weeks. So those of you who listen to my radio program every Saturday on K-Bright, let's get a plug in. It's noon every Saturday, 7:40 a.m. We'll tell you as soon as this is available. And it'll have the documentation for everything that I've told you tonight, or get a copy of this tape. And you can help to support the Granada Forum by getting it, this nice gentleman who's doing this, or get a tape of this and listen to it and get the source documentation, and then help us to get the word out. Many years ago, Whittaker Chambers left the Communist Party and identified Alger Hiss as having been a communist spy. Now, Alger Hiss was the man who wrote the United Nations Charter. He was at Yalta with President Roosevelt. He was the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. At the time, he was identified as a communist spy. And, of course, Alger Hiss lashed out at Whittaker Chambers and said what the mean, demeaning little man he was. And he was sort of fat and dumpy. He really wasn't very good-looking. He didn't have very nice teeth. And, of course, Alger Hiss was a member of the aristocracy. He was also deeply involved with this whole world occult movement. And Whittaker Chambers said, well, do you hate Alger Hiss? He's attacking you. And Whittaker Chambers said, I could never hate any man who believed, as I do, that life is not worth living, for which a man is not willing to die at any moment. And it's very reminiscent of the words of a man named Jim Elliot, who was a missionary who went into Central America to bring Christianity to the savages there. And he died on his last trip in, but shortly before that last trip, he was asked, well, aren't you afraid of the danger? And he said, no. He said, that man is no fool who gives that which he can never keep to gain that which he can never lose. That man is no fool who gives that which he can never keep to gain that which he can never lose. We're involved in a spiritual battle today. And so I sincerely hope that many of you will join together with those of us who pledged our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor in this epic struggle. After all, you have nothing to lose but your lives. You have eternity to gain. Remember those immortal words of James Russell Lowell. Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide. In that strife of truth with falsehood for the good or evil side. Then it is the brave man chooses, while the coward stands aside, until the multitude make virtue of the faith they have denied. Though the cause of evil prospers, yet his truth alone is strong. Though her portion be the scaffold, and upon the throne be wrong. But that scaffold sways the future, for in the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Monteith. If you have any questions, go ahead and line up at the back, and I'm sure Dr. Monteith will be happy to answer them for you. Please, no political statements, no opinions. Just ask the good doctor a question. He's got a lot of answers, I'm sure.
Okay, fine. If you have a question, we'd love to answer it if we can. No questions. Well, I guess we covered it all then.
What is a New Age religion? Is that dealing with the environment and all? Do you know, is the New World religion that they're trying to put on us?
Oh, what about the environment, its relationship to the New Age and the New World religion? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Well, that's it. I mean, they're using the environment to justify all sorts of increased government control. These people really have a worship of Mother Earth. They've substituted a worship of the God of the heavens for the earth. And it's paganism, and it's this old idea that we are all one. You are part of me, I'm part of you, you're part of the floor, I'm part of the ceiling, we're part of the trees and the flowers and the animals, and it's this pagan concept that has gripped the minds of so many people. Anything to draw people away from the truth that is recorded in the Holy Scriptures. Now, you have to understand that the environmental movement is largely being funded by the great foundations, the Lawrence Rockefeller Foundation. You go into the background of the funding of the environmental movement, and it comes right out of our great corporations. And why are even many of the corporations that are being impacted by the environmental movement funding it? Because they're not as interested in profit as they are in increasing the power of government over the lives of the people. And of course, the whole environmental movement then gets into sustainable development. Key phrase. What it really means is we got to kill off a lot of people so that we don't use up so many of the natural resources. And that is the major motive behind the genocide that is going on in the world today. And if you haven't got a copy of my little monograph on population control, we can either give you one or you can send it and we'll send it to you. But it's vitally important that people get that, understand that there is genocide going on throughout the world today, and it all ties into the environmental movement, the outlawing of DDT. DDT was not outlawed because it was entering the food chain, because it was killing people. It was outlawed because it was saving lives. And we give you the documentation on that. Alexander King from the Club of Rome talked about the tragedy that DDT was saving so many lives in Guyana. And Worthing, I think that's his name, actually had talked about how his major objection to DDT was because it was keeping people from dying. There is a Malthusian philosophy out there that ties into this whole thing. That manifests a hatred of humanity because humanity is God's highest creation.
Okay, thank you.
The microphone, please.
Don't be bashful. Just go back and pick up the mic there.
So the ultimate executive behind all of this is the bankers?
No, it's not the bankers. It's all Luciferian. I mean, the Luciferians are working with the banker. The bankers are energized by Luciferian forces, by Luciferian spirits. It's not the bankers, it's all of them. Maybe I should explain to you that Monsieur Perot finally decided that all 12 of the suspects had killed them. They had all killed him. And, of course, that was the secret of the murder on the Orient Express, and that's the secret of the problem we pointed out tonight. They are all involved, but the common denominator is Luciferianism.
They're energized by Luciferianism, but they are human beings acting as agents of this. Who are the human beings? Aren't they all bankers or members of the aristocracy?
No. They are at every level of our society. And, of course, you can get the demonic roots of globalism. You can get James Wardner's Unholy Alliances. You can get Paul Fisher's excellent book, Behind the Lodge Door. You can get Dennis Cuddy's book, The New World, New Age Order. But you'll find the membership list of the Council on Foreign Relations. You can get that by simply writing to 58 East 68th Street, New York City, New York. Get the CFR membership. You can write for the Trilateral Commission. We'll be glad to give you the name. You can get the names of those people. But this is a massive movement with literally millions of people who are energized by the dark side.
Yes, sir. You were talking about a secret club or a secret party. What's the exact name of that?
It never had a name. It was originally, the front organization was called the Round Table in England.
In England.
And when it came to America,
what year was that?
the front was the Council on Foreign Relations. according to Professor Quigley and according to certainly all of the evidence that we can find, the Council on Foreign Relations grew directly out of the meetings between Lord Milner's men and the inquiry in Paris back in 1919, and the offshoot of that was the formation of the Royal Institutes in every major Commonwealth nation, and in America, the Council on Foreign Relations, which was, according to Professor Quigley, a front group for J.P. Morgan and the small American Round Table Group.
And it started about 1914, the League of Nations, or what?
Well, the League of Nations started about 1919, 1920.
After the First World War.
After the First World War. The First World War was fought to justify the League of Nations, and when the League of Nations failed, then, of course...
The First World War
was about...
The League of Nations, yes.
Unbelievable.
Well, if you'd like to document that...
Is that unbelievable?
Well, I don't mind if you question that. I'd suggest you get my interview with Norman.
No, I'm not doubting that. It's just amazing.
Well,
unbelievable is amazing.
Well, we have, fortunately, an interview I did back in 1980 with Norman Dodd. Now, Norman Dodd was the Director of Research for the Reese Committee, which was commissioned by the 83rd Congress to investigate the great tax-exempt foundations. And in the course of the investigation, one of his research assistants, Miss Catherine Casey, had the opportunity of going through the early records of the Carnegie Endowment for...
What year was this?
This was, well, she was going through this in 1953 or 54.
This is way after.
But the records she was going through were 1908 and 1909, before the Carnegie Endowment was even incorporated. And he tells the story, it's on the tape, and she found that the members of the board were actually talking about how can we change the world, what's the best way to change the world, and they decided that war was the best way to change the world. And when they decided on that, they said, well, how can we get America into a war? That's what he told me in 1980.
They sat at the round table and said, how can we have some more?
Well, it wasn't the round table, this was the Carnegie Endowment.
In England?
No, in America.
In America.
Right.
All right, thanks a lot for your time.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
What I would like you to do is, I've got a son here that's just starting school, and I'd like you to address the issue of what should be the motivation and the goals of young Christian kids starting off on a career path.
To love the Lord, to know God's Word, that's the most important thing that you can give to your children, because we are headed for very, very bad times. I'm going to have to ask somebody to give me another little glass of water before my voice gives out. But really, you need reading, writing, and arithmetic, phonics. But the most important thing is traditional history. The most important thing really is to learn the fear of the Lord. Freedom does not come from doing whatever you want to. Freedom comes from doing what God tells us to do and following the Ten Commandments. There is no such thing as freedom if there's not restraint. Bring your child up in the ways of the Lord, and that's what we're called to do, and that's the best advice I can give you, sir. And I can tell you that looking back on my life, I'm a little older than you are, but I've got 3 kids, and all of them love the Lord. None of them are doctors, none of them are professional people, but I think maybe that's far more important than all the education I could have given them.
Dr. Monteith, I know you've interviewed Malachi Martin.
Yes.
And I want what's your opinion of him and his writings? And the second question is, do you know what's happened to Linda Thompson? I know you had some exposure to her, too.
All right, I don't know what's happened to Linda Thompson. Haven't heard from her in a long time. Malachi Martin is one of the most fascinating people around today. I think he's right on as far as his description of what's going on in the Catholic Church. In other words, the Catholic Church has been infiltrated, but the Protestant Church has been infiltrated too. But the primary drive of the Masonic movement was always to destroy first the Catholic Church and then Christianity altogether. And I think that what Malachi Martin says about the Masonic influence, about the Satanic rituals are true. And I take that not only because he has said it, but Pope Paul VI, before his early demise, talked about the Satanic smoke over the Vatican, and recently an exorcist, he's an archbishop from Africa, a black Catholic, has spoken about the demonic and satanic influence within the Vatican itself. So I don't think there's any question at all. He's right on. And of course, this idea that the Pope wants to lead this whole move towards world government would suggest that perhaps his allegiance is not to the God of the heavens, but to a political agenda. And I think this is rather frightening. I think we are indebted to Malachi Martin for what he's written.
Until I had read the late in his life interview with Norman Dodd, I personally had never heard of the Société Générale de Belgique, but lately on the internet, on some of the conspiracy discussion groups, I've seen speculation that they have... I'm getting to it. I've seen speculation that the Société Générale has co-opted the leadership of the Round Table, the Pilgrim Society, and I'm wondering if you can tell us anything from your research.
Well, I remember spending a couple of weekends with Norman Dodd, a wonderful gentleman, and he used to talk about the Société Belgique. It certainly was a very, very powerful force dealing with Belgian international interests, mining in Africa. I really believe, if you see what's happened in the Congo recently, they've gotten rid of Mobutu, they've gotten rid of Belgian and other interests, and America is moving in. That probably the Société Belgique has been somewhat eclipsed by the Anglo-American power structure. But when you start, who is the final arbiter? Who's really in charge of everything? Who are the three men who rule the world? I don't know. But I know who rules all of them, and that, of course, is Lucifer. I also know that if you read occultic writings, they talk about the inner government. They will tell you that Colonel Edward Mandell House, who led the inquiry to Paris in 1919 and was the man who manipulated Woodrow Wilson and really worked to prolong the war, to get America into the war, to ensure that Russia survived. We could spend an evening. Sometime you'll invite me down and I'll tell you the story of Colonel House, because his diary has been intentionally suppressed. It was bought up in 1976 by Times Mirror. So they copyrighted it so it couldn't be copied. It was given to Yale University to be kept for 50 years, available 1976, bought up by Times Mirror, copyrighted so it could be printed. I was there in 80, and they said it's going to be released any day. I called within 6 months. They said it's going to be released any day. They're simply suppressing it. That's how you suppress things. You copyright them. But certainly, Colonel House is part of what's known as the inner government, at least according to the occultists. Société Belgique, where it fits, I can't tell you.
Dr. Monteith.
Yeah. Let me just answer. The papers of Colonel House, his diary, is still back at Yale University. There are only 4 copies in the world, and I know where they all are. And we'll talk about that sometime if you give me another invitation. Fascinating, fascinating insight into one of the most evil men in the world. And, of course, the only way to understand Colonel Edward Mandell House was to understand that he was an occultist, and that's where his mystical powers came, and how he was able to control President Woodrow Wilson and the prime ministers and premiers of all of the European powers. Yes, sir.
Dr. Monteith, you briefly touched on something that I really wanted to ask you about. In the World Almanac, 1996, it states that in the United States, we have 158 million Christians of all denominations. If this were to be true, how could a people of one unity and accord allow what's happened in this country to happen when you see Christian pastors standing up on Sunday or whenever they have services complaining about what's happening out there? But let's do nothing but pray about it. Let's let God do everything for us. I think in God's eyes, that kind of negates our purpose of being alive here on the planet. Could you kind of expound on that a little bit?
All right, fine. Well, that's one of the great problems of our time, is the fact that the Christian church has been neutralized. Now, it's been neutralized because when young men go to our seminaries, they are taught that all you have to do is read Romans, and Romans 1 says, or Romans 2, I've forgotten Romans 1 or 2, I think it's Romans 1, and it says that all government officials are there by ordination of God, and you are to be subservient to them, and if you're not subservient to them, you're not being subservient to God. And since it says that in the Bible, it's got to be true. Well, it's not true at all, because Paul was writing a letter to the Romans living in Rome in the first century. If they spoke out, they tried to oppose the power of government. They were, subject to all sorts of horrible retribution. But more than that, I do not believe for 1 minute God wants us to be subservient to the Luciferian forces in our society today. Now, that doesn't mean we ought to take up arms. But it does mean we have to speak out and tell the truth. We've got to educate our ministers. We've got to educate our board of deacons. And that's why the information you heard tonight is important, but the documentation. You're really going to need this, and I hope we'll have it done. I've been working on this I started out, I thought it was going to take me 2 weeks. I've been at it for 4 months. We'll have it very soon. Get it to the ministers, get it to the board of deacons, and say, you have an obligation. We're dealing with Luciferian forces at the highest echelons of our government. This has nothing to do with politics. It has nothing to do with Republicans and Democrats. The Christian hierarchy has been infiltrated. We've got people out there working with so-called Christian quasi-political organizations telling us we've got to elect Bob Dole. Bob Dole? I mean, but I think there's another element. I really think that there's a spiritual blindness out there among Christians. And we've got to take those blinders off. And the only way we're going to do it is what we're doing. I've chosen talk radio because I think it's a great medium. And if you don't listen to me, why, I hope that you will. And get others to listen and get them to support our efforts. We have 17 stations across America. And we've done it. We're just, my wife and I and my son and a few of my loyal friends in Santa Cruz who come up and answer the phones and fold the letters and help us. And there are other people doing this. And support anybody who has a voice. If you have a voice, try to get others to support you. If you don't have a voice, then support the people who do have a voice. We have to get the word out. We're working against time. Things are unfolding at such an incredible, incredible speed. But we still have this window. And of course, but more than that, earlier on they talked about the spiritual aspect of this. And certainly 2 Chronicles 7:14, prayer. Pray for our leaders. Pray for our ministers. Pray for our nation. Prayer is so important. We have to, if we were worthy, I believe God would intervene. Now, he may very well be so angry at America, he's just going to destroy this nation. I don't know what's going to happen. But I know that the more people we can lead to the Lord, the more people we can get to really stand firmly on a spiritual foundation, the more people are going to be able to survive in the terrible, terrible times that lie ahead. We are in for some bad times. But our nation is spiritually blinded, sir. Yes.
Dr. Monteith, I don't know if you've ever run across Doc Marquis. He was born into the Illuminati family, was a member for 20 years, and he claims that the Illuminati is recruiting people through the Masons, and that their organizations, their mouthpieces, their think tanks are the Council for Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergers, Skull and Bones, all these secret societies, and that the Illuminati is really behind the New World Order and the takeover. Do you have any input to this or anything that you can add or subtract?
No comment.
Hello. I've been studying theosophy for the past couple years, and as far as I can see, it's only derived from the highest spiritual standards. I don't see anything Luciferian in it. Perhaps I'm just at the very bottom of the pyramid, but there are these study groups all over the world, and nothing about Lucifer is ever mentioned, but a lot is mentioned about, like I said, how the highest spiritual standards. So where can I get more information to corroborate what you're saying about it?
The Dark Side of Freemasonry that we have back there is one book, and you get in touch with me, I can get you all sorts of books that will get you in the background of theosophy. It comes from the very pit of hell. Have you read The Secret Doctrine, Isis Unveiled, the others?
Well, we're reading The Secret Doctrine right now. It takes a while.
Actually, Madame Blavatsky is deeply involved with Luciferianism, and she made many, many references to it. But I think if you want two books, one is the dark side of Freemason. The other side is the demonic side of globalism. We have both of them back there. They're $10 each. And if you don't want to put out the money, you can write to me, and I'll tear out the pages or copy the pages and get them to you. But The thing is, it is a fraternity within a fraternity. It's got to get good people in, just like the Masonic movement did. You see, Theosophy came out of Masonry. And Madame Blavatsky was a female Mason, as it were, whatever that means. But her ideas came out of the occult. And, of course, they go back to the mystery religions. And, of course, the underlying theme of this whole thing is deny the God of the Bible and deny that Jesus Christ is Lord. And if you get into it deeply enough, and I warn you, you're dabbling now, but the deeper you get into it, the more trouble you're going to get into. Find out what you're getting into. Demonic Side of Globalism has the quotations from Madame Blavatsky on Luciferianism and the Dark Side of Freemasonry. There's 2 books we carry here. Thank you. But please look into it, because I will tell you, a lot of good people have got sucked into this, and the deeper you get, the more it begins to possess you.
But I don't believe that Jesus Christ is the Lord of all, being a Jewish person, and I believe that there is a lot of truth before Christ was supposedly born on this earth. So if that's the basis you're coming from, I don't agree with that, because what we study in Theosophy comes from philosophies long before Jesus Christ, from Sanskrit and Hindu and Eastern religions.
It sure does. And where do those Eastern religions come from? And what is their source of their power? What is the source of the power of the Eastern religions? And, of course, it's Lucifer. But I hope that you really will look into this, and I hope it will bring you to the same understanding that I've come to through 68 years of study. Yes.
Yes, I have a question of many names, I guess, of Luciferian backers. Are there a shorter list of names who are anti-Lucifer?
Well, there's just 2 people. I mean, there's God and Lucifer, and then they've got their disciples on both sides. And I would like to think that I'm on the good side, but Lucifer has a lot of disciples out here, and they really are people who are Luciferian. They really do believe that. You see, what worship of Lucifer does, if you worship Lucifer, then you become your own God. And you remember the serpent's message in the Garden of Eden, if you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then you could be as God. Well, if you don't worship the God of heaven and you worship Lucifer, then you can become your own God. You can do whatever you want to. You determine what's right and wrong. But in the final analysis, then you don't need the Bible, you don't need God, you don't need salvation, you don't need a Savior. And that's really what this whole battle is all about. And if they can convince you, in fact, there's one quotation that we have, if you're interested, I could read it. It comes from Albert Pike. The true name of Satan is Yahweh, reversed. For Satan is not a black god, but the negation of God. The devil is the personification of atheism or idolatry. For the initiates, this is not a person, but a force created for good, but which may serve for evil. It is the instrument of liberty and free will. And you can be free if you worship Lucifer. But the trouble is there's really no freedom unless there are restraints, and those restraints come from God.
Including yourself, what are the top 10 that we could follow their teachings?
I'm sorry?
Along with yourself, who are the top 10 anti-Lucifer?
Don't follow my teachings. I have nothing to offer. I just repeat what I learned from the Bible in my studies. If you read the Bible, you follow the Lord. That's the person you follow. Don't follow for me or anybody else.
Hello, Mr. Monteith. This is the second time I've heard you. I heard you the other day on K Bright. My question is this. You just stated, if I heard you correctly, that Yahweh reversed is Satan?
That's what Albert Pike said.
That's what Albert Pike said,
right.
Okay.
I quoted that from Morals and Dogma. If you want the exact page, I can give it for you.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious because I've been following Zechariah Sitchin's work.
Who?
Zechariah Sitchin. Mm-hmm. You probably haven't heard of him. He's been researching the ancient texts of the Sumerians and so forth. But the name is very pronounced the same way, Yahweh, or Yahweh. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I was just curious when I had heard that.
I'm just telling you what Pike says.
Okay.
And what he's saying is, if you really want to be free, then you worship the devil. That's where you get liberty. And that's why people worship Satan, because now they can become gods. They can create a perfect society without God. They can create a new world order. And that's what they're all about. They are going to create a one new world utopian order without God.
Okay. My other question is this: do you think the Masons are following similar traditions of the Egyptians?
Yes, this all goes back. I mean, the Masonry goes back to Gnosticism. It goes back to the Kabbalah. It goes back to the mystery religions. And have you ever read Albert Pike, Morals and Dogma?
No, sir,
It's a fascinating book. You can usually find it in used bookstores. It's been actively suppressed. Every Mason is supposed to turn it back into the lodge, but often when they die, they just give it to a used bookstore. And you can find a copy, or you can come up to my library and spend a couple of weeks reading it. But he will explain to you this all has to do with the mysteries, and that's what the significance of the symbol is on the back of the dollar bill. We as a nation have gone over to the dark side. Now you have to understand that from the very inception of America, there have been two forces at work. One was the Masonic occult mystery religion, and the other was the Christian. And the Christian predominated really up until the time of Roosevelt, and then, of course, in 1935, under the urging of Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, why they put that symbol on the back of our dollar bill, and we've been going down ever since then, as the occult influences have simply overwhelmed the Christian influences in this country. And it's about time the Christians stood up, because there are a lot more of us than there are of them.
Yeah,
we've got right, and we've got God on our side, but we don't call on Him. And are we really worthy of His intervention?
Well, the thing that has bothered me is that people always say, leave it to God, leave it to God. And I know Gary Schnell will comment on this briefly, but I am of the opinion that, and I'm looking for this in the scriptures too, it says that we have to act with God in order to make change. And that's what my position is.
Well, I think that we are to act, and we're to pray to God. And we're not going to get Him to intervene. He's going to intervene when He's good and ready to. Right. We can't tell Him what to do. Maybe we may want to. Occasionally, when I'm under demonic attack, I can actually use my power as a Christian to defeat that demonic attack. I think anybody can who really loves the Lord. But we are involved in a spiritual battle, and we're just little grains of sand down here, but we just do our best. We're called to be the salt and the light of the earth. We're called to recognize that we struggle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the forces of the darkness of this earth, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And what are we to do? Put ye on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand. And boy, have you ever seen more evil days than we have right now.
Definitely.
Okay.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. Yes. Ephesians 6.
I was waiting for someone else to ask this, but I guess I'll have to do it. Where do Washington and Jefferson and Adams fit into your scheme?
All right. Washington was a Mason, but he was not into the occult aspect of it at all. He was a sincere Christian. And as he began to, he attended some Masonic meetings early on, but he wasn't a regular attendee, and I don't think he ever recognized the occult influence. He certainly wrote letters condemning the influence of the Illuminati, which was trying to get into America in the 1790s. So, in my estimation, Washington was a good Christian, but you have to understand that when America was founded, this was a treasonous act of treason against the crown, and these men's lives were in danger, and so many of them went into the Masonic Lodge because here they could have secret meetings and they could plot the overthrow of the British monarchy without fear of exposure. At least they hoped that. Now, Thomas Jefferson was a Mason, and he really was involved with all of the with the occult, really. He believed in a deity, but he didn't believe in Jesus Christ, although he called himself a Christian, and I have his writings where he did. He did not believe that Christ was God, nor in the supernatural. If you ever read the Jefferson Bible, you see what he really believed. I believe Adams was a Christian. In fact, Adams had a falling out with Jefferson because of his Masonic beliefs, and certainly Adams felt very, very strongly that Jefferson was betraying this dream that they had of creating a Christian republic. So you see this conflict. Certainly Benjamin Franklin was strongly involved with the occult, as was Thomas Paine. And we could talk about the secret Georgia Guidestones, which I mentioned last time I was here, in Elberton, Georgia, this occult monument back in Georgia, which is really dedicated to Thomas Paine. If you read the background in the books we've uncovered since then, Thomas Paine was brought to America by Benjamin Franklin. Thomas Paine then was a professional revolutionary who went to France to create the revolution there. In fact, the whole world revolutionary movement has its foundation in the occult. America was the only nation that had a revolution where we had a strong Protestant ethic, and America then created a free society. In France, they had the revolution, and they went right back into dictatorship. The same thing happened in all the countries of Europe.
I think you said Washington and Adams were Trinitarians. You believe that?
Beg pardon?
You believe Washington and Adams were Trinitarians?
No, I don't think so. I think Adams was probably a Unitarian, but I think that he believed in the divinity of Christ, and I believe that George Washington did. But they may not very well have been the Trinitarian beliefs of today.
I'll try one more and sit down. You think then that you can rally the United States of America by disowning Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Paine, and those people?
Well, I don't think that we can rally them behind Jefferson, because I think Jefferson was involved in the occult. And I think what we have to recognize is these two parallel tracks I talked of. And we have to be objective, and we have to be informed, and we have to talk about the occult and Masonic influence that has been here since the inception of America. Some people will tell you America is a Masonic republic. It's not. But there has always been this Masonic influence. And if you go back and you look at the streets of Washington, D.C., you'll see that they are laid out in Masonic symbology. And every one of the buildings back there has a Masonic plaque on it. The Masons are here, and they're working like termites. Only the foundations of our republic now are fairly well eroded.
Do you know anything about James Clerk Maxwell?
No, I don't.
The unified field theory?
No.
Or anything about our mathematics being changed so we couldn't advance scientifically at the turn of the century like we should have?
That's not my field, sir.
Okay, well, I'll just ask, do you think Teddy Roosevelt was originally a fairly good president, but he was bought off to run against Taft?
I think he was into this whole Masonic thing. If you read Arthur Schlesinger, he will tell you that Teddy Roosevelt was our first aristocrat. He was part of this whole movement. Now, we have an image of Teddy Roosevelt. That's our image, but sometimes our images are not reality. It's sort of symbolism over substance. They create our images for us. I love the image of Teddy Roosevelt, this rugged individualist out there, fighting the battle at San Juan Hill and shooting the bears. But he really believed in this whole idea of an aristocracy ruling the masses, just as his namesake Franklin Delano Roosevelt did. But I'm drawing upon what Arthur namesake Franklin Delano Roosevelt did. But I'm drawing upon what Arthur Schlesinger says, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. is part and parcel of this whole movement, knows a lot more about it than I do. I wish that the image we had of Teddy Roosevelt was true, but I'm afraid it's not. We have many idols with clay feet.
Doctor, there are no more questions. We want to thank you for coming this evening.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, but you want to get the other pages.